The rebellion of the Alpujarras of 1568–71, sometimes called the War of the Alpujarras, was the second such revolt against the Castilian Crown in the mountainous Alpujarra region. The rebels were Moriscos, the nominally Catholic descendants of the Mudéjares following the first rebellion of the Alpujarras. By the 15th century, the reconquest of Spain by the Catholic powers had left only the Kingdom of Granada, part of Andalucia in southern Spain, in the hands of the Moors. In 1492, Granada City fell to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, and under the terms of capitulation the whole region came under Christian rule. However, the Muslim inhabitants of the city soon revolted against Christian rule in 1499, followed by the mountain villages. This revolt was suppressed fairly quickly by 1501. The Muslims under Christian rule were then obliged to convert to Christianity, becoming a nominally Catholic population known as Moriscos. Discontent among the new Moriscos led to a second rebellion led by a Morisco known as Ibn Umar, starting in December 1568 and lasting till March 1571. This violent conflict took place mainly in the mountainous Alpujarra region, on the southern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, between Granada City and the Mediterranean coast, and is often known as the War of the Alpujarras. Most of the Morisco population was then expelled from the Kingdom of Granada and was dispersed throughout the Kingdom of Castile. As this left many mountain villages in Granada almost empty, Catholic resettlers were brought in from other parts of the country. Between 1609 and 1614, the Spanish crown undertook the expulsion of the Moriscos from all over Spain. Although about half of Granada's Morisco remained in the region after the dispersal, only 2,000 were expelled from the city of Granada, many remaining mixed with and protected by old Christians who were less hostile towards them than in other regions of Spain. Background: fall of Granada and the 1499–1501 Muslim revolts. The Kingdom of Granada was the last Muslim-ruled state in Spain. After a long siege, the city of Granada fell to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabel. In 1492, the Muslim population was initially tolerated under the terms of the Treaty of Granada. They were allowed to stay in the dwellings, to be judged according to their own laws. They would not be obliged to convert to Christianity. However, they did come under pressure to convert to Christianity, and growing discontent led to an uprising in 1499 in Granada City, quickly put down, and in the following year two more serious revolts in the mountain villages of the Alpujarra, the region below the Sierra Nevada. Ferdinand himself led an army into the area. There were also revolts in the western parts of the kingdom. Suppression by the Catholic forces was severe, with the most violent episode occurring in La Yarda and Arax, where 200 Muslims were burnt in the local mosque. This revolt enabled the Catholics to claim that the Muslims had violated the terms of the Treaty of Granada, which were therefore withdrawn. Throughout the region, Muslims were now forced to choose between conversion to Christianity or exile. The vast majority chose conversion and became known as Moriscos or New Christians, though many continued to speak Andalusian Arabic and to maintain the Moorish customs. Causes of the Second Rebellion. In 1526, Charles I issued an edict under which laws against heresy would be strictly enforced. Among other restrictions, it forbade the use of Arabic and the wearing of Moorish dress. The Moriscos managed to get this suspended for 40 years by the payment of a large sum. Since now all remaining Moors were officially Christian, mosques could be destroyed or turned into churches. The children had to be baptized, marriage had to be performed by a priest. There was little and no follow-up in terms of explaining Christianity. Indeed, the priests themselves were mostly too ignorant to do so. On the other hand, they punished Moriscos who failed to participate in Sunday Mass. Moriscos had to learn, in Latin, which would have been meaningless to them, the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, the Credo and the Ten Commandments. Children had to be baptized and marriage had to be under Christian rites. Inevitably, tension built up. The Archbishop of Granada, convinced that the Moriscos were maintaining their customs and traditions and would never become real Christians, called in 1565 a synod of the bishops of the Kingdom of Granada. It was agreed that the policy of persuasion should be replaced by one of repression, and that the measures of 1526 should now be applied. This meant prohibition of all the distinctive Morisco practices, language, clothing, public baths, religious ceremonies, etc. Moreover, in each place where the Moriscos lived at least a dozen old Christians should be installed. Morisco houses should be inspected on Fridays, Saturdays and feast days to ensure that they were not practicing Quranic rites. The heads of household should be closely watched to ensure that they were setting a good example. The sons should be taken to Old Castile at the cost of the parents, to be brought up learning Christian customs and forgetting those of their origins. Philip II, who had become king in 1556, gave his approval. The result was the Pragmatica of 1 January 1567. The Moriscos tried to negotiate its suspension, as in 1526, but this king was inflexible. A Morisco leader, Francisco Núñez Mali, made a statement protesting against the injustices committed against the Moriscos. Day by day our situation worsens. We are maltreated in every way, and this is done by judges and officials. How can people be deprived of their own language, with which they were born and brought up? In Egypt, Syria, Malta and elsewhere there are people like us who speak, read and write in Arabic, and they're Christians like us. The American historian Henry Charles Lee wrote, "The Moriscos had come to the parting of the ways. There was no middle course and they had the naked alternative of submission or rebellion. As the failure of their appeals became evident, the Moriscos of Granada began to prepare for rebellion, holding secret meetings in the Moorish quarter, the Albayacin. The authorities arrested Moriscos who they thought might be conspiring. They also made plans to expel Moriscos from the kingdom and replace them by old Christians." After a year of fruitless negotiations, in 1558 the Morisco leaders decided to take up arms. Rebellion of 1568–71. In the months following publication of the Pragmatica on 1 January 1567, the Moriscos began to prepare the rebellion. Weapons, flour, oil and other provisions were stored in caves which were inaccessible and safe enough for 6 years. The principal leaders, including some from the Alpujarra, held meetings in private houses in the Albayacin, and from there issued their orders. At a meeting on the 17th of September 1568 it was proposed that they should elect a chieftain to lead the revolt. The rebellion started on Christmas Eve in the village of Besna in the Lecran Valley, when Hernando de Córdoba y Valle was named king. In a solemn ceremony, they clothed him in purple according to the old ritual for the kings of Granada, and many rich Moriscos attended, wearing black garments. He was chosen because he descended from the lineage of the caliphs of Córdoba, the Umayyads, and he therefore took the Moorish name Aben Humayr. Numerous other places in the Tafas of Orgiva, Poqueira, Uviles and other Morisco villages in the Alpujarra followed suit. The first action by the rebels was in Granada City. It was led by Aben Humayr's Grand Vizier, Farax Aben Farax, who on that same night of 24–25 December entered the Albayacin with a group of Monfis, outlaws who for one reason or another had left the villages and roamed in the mountains. His aim was to persuade the Morisco inhabitants to join the revolt, but he had little success. Only a few hundred followed him. This failure in the capital had a decisive effect on the course of the campaign throughout the Kingdom of Granada. The rebellion took on a fanatic character, with the torturing and murder of priests and sacristans, the destruction and profanation of churches. In this the bands of Monfils played a large part. First phase. The Spanish campaign was led by the Marqués de Mudéjares in the west of the Alpujarra and the Marqués de los VIAF in the east. Mudéjares, coming from Granada in January 1569, had quick success over terrain which should have favoured the defenders. He overcame the first natural obstacle, a bridge at Tablate, which the Moors had partially destroyed, and reached Orgiva in time to rescue Christians held captive in the tower. The first major battle was fought in a river valley east of Orgiva, where the Moors were defeated. An advanced detachment then contrived to cross a narrow ravine and climb a steep mountainside to reach the village of Bubian in the Poqueira Valley, where Ibn Humayr had made his headquarters and the Moors had stored equipment and valuables. They were soon joined by the Marqués and the bulk of his army, taking a longer but safer route. In the next few days the army crossed the mountains and descended on Portugos and Pitas, again freeing Christian captives in the churches. Further, the way was open to the villages further east. The American historian Henry Charles Lee wrote of Mudéjares' short but brilliant campaign. Through heavy snows and intense cold and over almost inaccessible mountains he fought battle after battle, giving the enemy no respite and following up every advantage gained. The Moriscos speedily lost heart and sought terms of surrender. By the middle of February the rebellion was practically suppressed. Ibn Humayr was a wanderer, hiding in caves by day and seeking shelter by night in houses which had letters of surety. Indeed, at Portugal some Moorish leaders had attempted to negotiate surrender terms with Mudéjares, who replied that he would intercede with King Philip, but that in the meantime the punishment of rebels must continue. If he did report to the king, this did him no good as it reinforced charges against him of undue clemency. In fact, the Christian campaign was compromised by a long-standing enmity between the two commanders, and this was fomented by the Chancery in Granada, which on several occasions sent complaints about Mudéjares to King Philip. The subsequent campaign was marked by excesses committed by the troops. This was not a disciplined army but consisted largely of untrained volunteers, who were not paid but counted on the loot they could gather. The chronicler Pérez de Hita read that half of them were the worst scoundrels in the world, motivated only by the desire to steal, sack and destroy the Morisco villages. There were also many acts of vengeance by Moriscos against Old Christians. Some priests were flayed alive, being reminded of the severity towards those who did not attend Mass, to women who would not uncover their faces and generally to those continued practicing their old rites. Churches were systematically set on fire and looted, likewise the houses of the priests and those of Christians in general. Both sides sold as slaves many of the captives. The Moriscos sold Christians to merchants from North Africa in exchange for weapons. For their part, those whom the Christian soldiers captured, especially women, were regarded as war booty, and they were entitled to keep the takings for themselves as the crown renounced the fifth part of the proceeds normally due. Chiefs and officers also took prisoners for themselves, including children. The crown itself did benefit from the sale of slaves, as in the case of many of the Moors from Uviles who were sold at the market in Granada for the benefit of the king. This slavery, including women and children, was one of the reasons why the Morisco resistance persisted. Second phase. This lasted from March 1569 until January 1570. Now the initiative lay with the Morisco rebels, who had gained support as towns in the plain and elsewhere joined the revolt. Thus the number rose from 4,000 in 1569 to 25,000 in 1570, including some Berbers and Turks. The tactic was to ambush their opponents, avoiding combat on open ground, relying on the knowledge of the intricate terrain of the Sierras and occupying the heights from which they could launch audacious attacks. The Spanish Navy was called upon to bring reinforcements to the army, and to protect the Granada coast against Ottoman reinforcements from North Africa. Third phase. This began in 1570, after King Philip had relieved the Marquess of Mudéjares of his command and appointed in his place his own half-brother, Don John of Austria, to take over all command, and the Marquess of VIAF to pursue operations in the eastern part of the kingdom. Lee describes VIAF as ambitious, arrogant and opinionated. He thrust himself into the war and mismanaged it at every turn, but he was a favorite of the king, who supported him through it all. Great preparations were made to give Don John a force which befitted his dignity and should speedily crush all resistance. The towns and cities were summoned to furnish the quotas, and the Spanish ambassador at Rome was ordered to bring the Italian galleys to Spain, to aid the home squadron in guarding the coast and intercepting succors from Africa, and also to convey the tertio of Naples. This was a big mobilization to deal with a revolt by a mountain people, with no military training nor organization, and ill-equipped with weaponry. But King Philip was obsessed by his troubles abroad and clearly felt he had to eliminate this problem on his doorstep. An Ottoman fleet was raiding the Spanish coasts, and it had captured the Balearic Islands in 1558. In the Spanish Netherlands, the preaching of Calvinist leaders had led to riots in 1566 and to open warfare in 1568. Philip did not want trouble in his own backyard. Moreover, like Catholic leaders everywhere in Europe, he was determined to stamp out heresy of all kinds, and the Moors had by now been formally classified as heretics. Don John arrived at Granada in April 1569. Returning to Lee's account, conflicting opinions led to prolonged discussions during which nothing was done. The campaign went to pieces. The pacified Moriscos, reduced to despair by the withdrawal of Mudéjares, sent back the safeguards and withdrew their oaths of allegiance, and with them went many places that had previously remained loyal. Granada was virtually besieged, for the Moriscos ravaged the Vega up to the gates. The rebellion, which had hitherto been confined to the Alpujarras and Sierra Nevada, spread on the one side to the mountain of Almeria and on the other to those of Malaga. The whole land was aflame, and it looked as though the power of Spain was inadequate to extinguish the conflagration. In an attack on Albuñuelas, the Spanish troops killed all the men who did not escape and brought back 1,500 women and children, who were divided among the soldiers as slaves. In October that year, the king proclaimed a war of fire and blood, no longer just a matter of punishing a rebellion. He also gave free rein to the soldiers to take whatever plunder they could find, whether slaves, cattle or property. In January 1570, Don John launched his new campaign with a force of 12,000 men. Another contingent led by the Duke of Sessa had 8,000 foot and 350 horse. There was renewed fighting in the Pittas-Poqueira area in April 1570. As the campaign went on and villages were captured, the Catholic forces were much reduced by desertions. On the 10th of February, after a 2-month siege, Don Juan conquered Galera and ordered its destruction. In March he took Serón, and at the end of April he headed for the Alpujarra. setting up his headquarters at Pajules. There he was joined by a second army under the Duke of Sesa, which had left Granada in February and had crossed the Alpujarra from west to east. At the same time, a third army had come from Antequera to reach the Sierra of Bentomise, another focus of the rebellion, at the beginning of March. Fourth phase. This lasted from April 1570 until the spring of 1571. Catholic forces were greatly reinforced with infantry and cavalry. Led by Don John and the Duke of Sesa, they launched a new campaign, invading the Alpujarra, destroying houses and crops, putting men to the sword and taking prisoner all the women, children and elderly people whom they found in the path. Spain had strained every nerve and had raised an overwhelming force to accomplish what Mudéjares had done with a few thousand men a 12-month earlier. Quote, in May, King Abanabu at last accepted surrender terms, under which those who gave themselves up and handed over the weapons would have their lives spared. But when some Berbers appeared with stories of large reinforcements on the way, Abanabu decided to fight on. The reports here are muddled. Some say that 3 galleys which had just arrived from Algiers with arms, munitions and food turned back because they heard Abu was surrendering. However, this may be. No such help reached the rebels, but the Catholics were given an excuse to resume hostilities. The Sierra, in September 1570, was attacked simultaneously from both ends with a war of ruthless devastation, destroying all harvests, killing the men and bringing in women and children by the thousand as slaves. What few prisoners were taken were executed or sent to the galleys. Quote, this advance by the royal troops opened a breach between those of the Moriscos who wanted to continue the fight and those who argued for seeking terms of surrender. In May, following a meeting at Andrax, many rebels fled to North Africa. Soon afterwards, the leader of those who favored surrender, Hernando el Habaki, was executed on the order of Abanabu. Although from October 1570 many Moriscos gave themselves up, several thousand went on fighting. Most of them took shelter in caves, but many of these died from suffocation when the Christian troops lit fires at the entrances. In 1571, John of Austria finally succeeded in suppressing the rebellion in the Alpujarra. The last rebels, after losing the fortress of Uvals, were killed in their caves, among them Abanabu, who was stabbed to death by his own followers in a cave near Betules. Resistance then collapsed. Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, the more enlightened of the contemporary Spanish sources, made a bitter comment. Day by day we fought our enemies, in the cold of the heat, hungry, lacking munitions, suffering continual injuries and deaths until we could confront our enemies, a warlike tribe, well armed and confident in terrain which favored them. Finally they were driven from the houses and possessions, men and women were chained together, captured children were sold to the highest bidder, or carried away to distant places. It was a dubious victory, with such consequences that one might doubt whether those whom God wished to punish were ourselves or the enemy. Extent of the rebellion. When the rebellion began, the Kingdom of Granada counted barely 150,000 inhabitants, most of them Moriscos. The exact number who rebelled is unknown, but the ambassadors of France and of the Republic of Genoa at the Madrid count estimated that there were 4,000 rebels in January 1569 and 25,000 by the spring of 1570, of whom some 4,000 were Turks or Berbers from North Africa who had come to support the rebellion. On the other side, the royal army had at the beginning 2,000 foot soldiers and 200 cavalry under the command of the Marqués de Mudéjares. The number increased substantially when Don John took charge. In the siege of Galera he had 12,000 men, while the Duke of Sesa at the same time commanded between 8,000 and 10,000 men. From its start in the Alpujarra, the rebellion spread to the plains and to other mountainous regions on the edges of the kingdom. A particularly dramatic conflict took place on the ridge above Frigiliana, in the Axarquia, where entire families of Moriscos from all around had gathered. The siege lasted from June 1569 till September, when Spanish reinforcements were brought in by sea. Moriscos living in the towns, including the capital, Almeria, Malaga, Guadix, Baza and Motul, and the surrounding areas did not take part in the uprising, although they sympathized with it. This distinct attitude of the towns can be explained by the presence of a greater number of Old Christians, and better integration of the Moriscos in these communities. On the other hand, in the Alpujarra and other regions, where the rebellion caught on, there were villages where the only Old Christian was the parish priest.